Okie dokie. So you've now learned how we create large molecules and break them up to make smaller molecules. Let's get into the nitty gritty and start with our first of those four compounds of life, the carbs, the carbohydrates. Now, we're going to talk about different kinds of carbohydrates. We're going to start off with monosaccharides, the building blocks of the polymers. Then we're going to go on to disaccharides. Sometimes related to that, you'll hear oligosaccharides. And finally, polysaccharides. So first little tutorial here. The monomers of carbohydrates are monosaccharides. So say that with me. The monomers of carbohydrates are monosaccharides. So it's going to be really important that you learn what the monomers of each of these different four compounds of life are. So don't let that slide just right through in and out. You want to make sure you learn those. So the monomers of carbs are monosaccharides. Now mono, of course, as we said, means one. Saccharides means sugars. So the monomers of carbohydrates are little single sugars. And yeah, carbs are sugars. That's why, you want to, if you're trying to watch your weight, you don't want to fill too much up on carbs because those are sugars. And big carbs, the starchy stuff that we love, like pasta, those are larger, and so it's going to take more energy to break them down into the small monosaccharide components that your cells can take up. And you may know from personal experience, I know I do, whatever your body can't break down and use, it likes to store for later in the form of fats, which we'll be talking more about fats in a little bit. So monomers of carbs are monosaccharides. And the general molecular formula for these monosaccharides is that they come in multiples of this little formula here, CH2O. So for example, glucose, the one that we like to talk about because it's what our cells crave, it's the food for our cells, it's a monosaccharide. Recall that the formula is C6H12O6. Just remember that now, because when we get to cellular respiration and photosynthesis, we're going to be saying that a lot. So might as well get a good head start on that. So notice C6H12O6 is in fact a multiple of CH2O. Works like a charm. As you may recall, you can represent different molecules in different structural ways. So this is a linear model of glucose. So 6 carbons there. There's your C6. There are 12 hydrogens, and of course there are 6 oxygens here if you count them all up. Now the actual glucose molecule in real life looks something like this. This is called your space-filling model, or I like to call it the bubble model. And that's really kind of more what a model looks like in real life. But another way to represent it is through what's called a ring diagram or a ring structure. And because glucose is a 6-carbon molecule, we have the shape of a hexagon here, right, which has 6 sides. And at every corner is in a carbon, with the exception of this one over here where we have an oxygen. So different ways of representing this ring structure. This is kind of more, it fills in the details for you. Notice that everywhere you have a carbon, you have either a hydroxyl group coming off on one side or a hydrogen coming off on the other. The oxygen just stands alone. It has nothing coming off of it. Now we want to number these carbons because that will be important in a little bit for some of the other details that we're going to be talking about carbs. So the carbon right after the oxygen here, we're going to call this carbon number 1. Next to that is carbon 2, 3, 4, 5, and this last one up here, which is kind of branched off, is carbon number 6. So hold that thought for a minute, but we'll be coming back to that concept of numbering carbons in a little bit. Here's another representation. This is actually, you probably see more often, where the carbons are not actually drawn in at each corner. It's just assumed that every time there's a corner in a ring structure, there's a carbon there. So let's say that again. Every time there's a corner in a ring structure, whether it be a 6-carbon hexagon shape or a 5-carbon pentagon shape or whatever, know that there's a carbon there. So when you get real fancy into biochemistry or organic chemistry, they stop drawing in those letters altogether, and they'll just draw something like this. And you just know this means there's a carbon every corner, and attached to that carbon is a hydrogen, and in the case of glucose, also a hydroxyl group there. So just different ways of representing the So let's get into a little more detail about monosaccharides. We can classify monosaccharides three ways depending on how you're representing them structurally. So in linear diagrams, we can classify the monosaccharides as D or L. We can classify them as ketose or aldose. And finally, we can, in the ring structure, classify the monosaccharide as an alpha or a beta. So let's see how we do this. Let's go. One way, if you're drawing the molecule, the monosaccharide, in linear structure, as you see here, then you can categorize the monosaccharide as a D sugar or an L sugar. Let's see if I can test my sign language here. D versus L. So this only applies when you're drawing the molecule in its linear fashion. Does not apply when you're drawing it in its ring structure. So what we're going to do is, remember how we numbered those carbs? So think back to the ring structure and how we numbered carbon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if you drew it down like this, we want to look at the penultimate carbon. Well, I love that word, penultimate. It means the next to last carbon. So not the last one, but the next to last one. So in this case of glucose, it would be carbon number 5. And so if we look at the penultimate carbon, number 5, and we look next to it, if the hydroxyl group, the OH, is on the left, and actually I gotta be careful here because I'm looking into a camera, so everything's backwards, you know, mirror image kind of thing. If the hydroxyl group is to the left, then we say that this is an L sugar. Okay, so in this particular example here, this is an L sugar because the hydroxyl group on the 5th carbon is to the left, on the second to last carbon. Whereas if we had flipped that hydroxyl group over, so in this particular sugar, this is not a glucose because this only has 5 carbons. So the next to last carbon in this particular example would be number 4 because there's only a total of 5. So the hydroxyl group goes to the right, making this a D sugar. So this one's a D if the penultimate carbon's hydroxyl group goes to the right, and it's an L sugar if the penultimate carbon's hydroxyl group goes to the left. Got it? We can also categorize monosaccharides as ketose sugars or aldose sugars. How do we do that? So if you think back to your functional groups, you might remember what a ketone is and what an aldehyde is, etc. So if we go back over here, so here are aldoses. Ose, by the way, means sugar, O-S-E. Anytime you see ose, you know it's a sugar. These are also called aldehyde sugars because recall the structural formula of the functional group in aldehyde. We got carbon, double bond, oxygen, and a hydrogen. And over here, it's at the end of the molecule. So this particular compound in this example happens to be glyceraldehyde. And because the aldehyde is at the end of the molecule, in other words, it's on the terminal carbon, the last carbon in this group here, then we call this an aldose or an aldehyde sugar. Similarly, here is a pentose because pent means 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbons here. And in this case, this is ribose. But again, at the end is an aldehyde group, functional group. And so the carbon containing the aldehyde is at the end, making this an aldose sugar. So the carbonyl, this is a carbonyl group, is at the end. And down here, hexoses, that means 6 carbons. We have glucose and we have galactose, very similar compounds, just differ in terms of where the hydroxyl group is on the left or right. But again, if we go to the terminal carbon here, we can see the carbonyl group is on the end. So this is an aldehyde group at the end, making this an aldose sugar or an aldehyde sugar. Okay, comparing that to the opposite, ketoses or ketone sugars. So remember, a ketone functional group has a carbon, an R group here, an R group here, and then a double bond oxygen. And so in order to be a ketose sugar, the carbonyl group has to be somewhere other than the end of the molecule. So in this case of dihydroxyacetone, we see that our carbonyl is right here, C double bond O, R group over here, R group over here. So that makes that a ketose sugar, or a ketone sugar. And down here, here's your pentose, a 5-carbon sugar, but this one's ribulose. Notice the carbonyl is internal, so you see double bond O. Here would be one R group. Here is the other R group. And last example, fructose, another 6-carbon sugar. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But again, notice that the carbonyl is internal, so C double bond O, R group, and R group down here. So being that the carbonyl is internal, that makes it a ketose sugar or ketone sugar. All right, so got the difference between aldoses and ketoses. Again, another way to classify monosaccharides. Okay, one more way to classify monosaccharides, and that is alpha versus beta. And let's take a quick look at how we would draw the symbols for alpha and beta, because you may see it written both ways. So to draw an alpha, it's a little symbol that kind of looks like that. And beta kind of looks like a B. So these are both Greek symbols. So you may see these used interchangeably. Sometimes they spell out alpha, sometimes they use the symbol, sometimes they spell out beta, and sometimes they... Okay, so how do we determine if a monosaccharide is an alpha or a beta? Well, let's go back to our example of glucose, and let's compare an alpha glucose to a beta glucose. So recall our ring structures and our numbering of the carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. What we're going to do is look at carbon number 1. What's going on with it? Specifically, we're going to look at the hydroxyl group on carbon number 1. Is compare the orientation of the hydroxyl group on carbon number 1 to the orientation of carbon number 6. If they are opposites, meaning the hydroxyl group on carbon 1 is down when carbon number 6 is up, or vice versa, then it's an alpha glucose. If the hydroxyl group on carbon 1 is pointing in the same direction as carbon number 6, like this or like this, then it is a beta glucose. But just recap one more time. Alpha glucose, carbon 1 hydroxyl down when carbon 6 is up, and beta glucose, hydroxyl up when carbon 6 is also up. The hydroxyl on carbon 1 is up when carbon number 6 is also up. Okay, got that? So just to recap, what are the ways we classified monosaccharides? We said if written in linear form, they could be D or L. We said that you can classify monosaccharides as ketose or aldose, and you can classify it as alpha or beta. All right, I think you guys are ready to go on to talk about disaccharides.